Hello. Hi. How's everybody doing? Can you hear me? Can you let me know when you hear me? Hello. Welcome to the Live Poetry Corner. This is something I promised during the Maximum Fun Drive, and I wanted to deliver on that promise because you all delivered on your tremendous number of donations. So thank you so much for that. Um, I am going to read a few poems from a particular poet, and then I'm going to give you the opportunity to ask questions. I know I'm starting a little early, but I just want to reward you, very disciplined, loyal individuals. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. This is the poetry book I will be reading from today. It is by Jude Nutter. It is called The Curator of Silence. And I'm going to read about 3 poems from it and tell you a little bit about the poet. And then hopefully we'll all have a good time today. So Jude Nutter, who wrote The Curator of Silence, was born in New Yorkshire, England, grew up near Hanover in northern Germany, and currently lives and works in Minneapolis, St. Paul. She has 3 books of poems. The first, Pictures of the Afterlife, came out in 2002. The Curator of Silence, 2007. And then I Wish I Had a Heart Like Yours, Walt Whitman, came out in 2009. Her poems are very unique because she has a very kind of unique perspective. She's had a very kind of unusual upbringing, not just because she's lived all over the world, but also because she briefly trained to be an EMT, worked with adolescents at an alcohol treatment center, lived in Antarctica for 2 months through an NSF Writers and Artists program. And she deals a lot kind of with these various viewpoints in her poetry. I first became familiar with her. She submitted some poems to the Missouri Review, which is the literary magazine I worked at when I was an undergrad at University of Missouri-Columbia, also known as Mizzou. And I really, really liked her poetry. And one of the poems that we published is the first one I'm going to read to you today, partially because it is so on McElroy theme. It is called Horses, and it is all about horses. And it's incredible. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. Again, the poem is called Horses. We pass them being wheedled and cajoled around small corrals, a confetti of spit across each wide breast, and the sweat between their legs worried up into foam. Their hooves flash in the dirt like polished bells. We pass them as they sleep, standing up among the dandelions and tasseled grasses gone to seed. They enter our lives like fragments of Eden, the place that has always been our most difficult, elaborate dream. And once seen, even from a freeway when you're doing 60, aware of your own peril, it's an effort of will to take your eyes from a horse in a field. Grace is like that. No other animal occupies its skin so precisely or walks forward so carefully as if pushing through great halls of dark water, chest deep in a stiff current. I don't believe we are meant to think about death, even on those evenings when a thin mist rides on the fields and their hooves waver beneath them like votive flames. A horse becomes its own myth and religion. Out from the dark machinery of its body, something better and more beautiful is always about to begin. And if you ever need proof that it's good to have a physical body, touching a horse in this life is the closest you will get to it. To catch grace off guard, a lone horse dozing in a field, the long reach of its neck presented to the world, its thick lower lip fallen away from the fence of its teeth, and there, beguiling as God's empty pocket, pale skin of the inner mouth. Before you die, look into the eyes of a horse at least once and discover how each is an empty room lit by a single candle. If the gods ever come down to walk among us, this is where they will live. And so when a horse, seeing nothing about us it can recognize, lowers its deep, soft mouth to the grass, and when that grass, appearing wet in the sunlight, rises to greet it, as if the lips of the dead were puckered skyward for its kiss, it should be no surprise. How can we not love an animal that spends so much of its life with its mouth so close to the dirt? That they take with such tenderness the mints and the carrots we offer, as if the world were ours to give, is the miracle that they let us slip on the sky blue halter and lead them through the cool of the evening. I hope you all are snapping at home right now. I hope you all are snapping and clapping and just silently exhaling. It's a very beautiful poem. It's such a profound affection for a horse. There have been a lot of poems written about horses, but this one is really remarkable. When I was working at the literary magazine, we had what we called horse poets, which were people that wrote a lot about horses. And I think if I only read that poem, you could kind of submit Jude Nutter as a horse poet because she writes it so beautifully. And that line about how can we not love an animal that spends so much of its life with its mouth so close to the dirt? Like, that line has stuck with me my entire life. Like, I think about that line every time I see a horse. And the before you die, look into the eyes of a horse at least once and discover how each is an empty room lit by a single candle. Oh my gosh, how perfect is that? That's like one of those lines that makes me think like it is godly to write poetry because that is so beautiful. Okay, so I have two more poems I want to read. I think I'll read The Garden Party next. She writes a lot about death in her poems, and so I just want to warn you that this poem is about that, but not in like a excruciating detail, just kind of a nod to it. So just to kind of warn you, for those of you that attended the Facebook poetry stream that I did, I talked about a poet that had a lot of references to death, and it's kind of unavoidable because poetry often is about kind of the large, like incomprehensible things that really cause you to kind of muse and capture it in a new way. And so I apologize, but this is The Garden Party. We spend our whole lives preparing to lose each other. We are never ready. On the headland, every bench that faces west is inscribed to someone's memory. And how fitting it is to lean back all afternoon against the names of the dead and remember we never love anything deep enough to hold it in this world. And yet how beautiful for those on the deck of a boat rounding the headland at evening, that litany of small plaques hoarding the light. It is easy to see why the dead move westward over water, toward that slim line of radiance along the horizon, where the buildings of some great city are forever burning, resplendent, not with flame, but with the echoes of bells and singing, the brazen seduction we have come to call heaven. Sit here looking west towards the horizon's false promise of passage, and imagine how the dead must feel, straddling that gap between the deck of a boat and the jetty with one foot in midair and the other still in this world, as the captain reaches his hand out to help them over the gunwale. Imagine the bark of gravel and the grit beneath the sole of a shoe as a body pushes forward over its fulcrum onto a boat deck slick with spray, then the vessel pulling smoothly away. How sudden the heaviness we become, and how quickly it is over. But if the horizon truly is a place of arrival, a destination, then at least you can bribe or sweet talk the captain and come at last to where the seam of water and sky sweats open, to where the dead, lacquered in their own bright alchemy, are relaxing under umbrellas at glass-topped tables or strolling through the lime trees with fistfuls of petits fours and fruits, where the serpent of eternity locked in its perfect circle sleeps in the calm shade beneath someone's chair. You will find that the soul, having stepped at last out of the body's darkness and into something useful, is more fearsome and beautiful than you dared to imagine, that it smells of jasmine and warm linen. You don't have to believe in anything, but if you imagine it, then it could be true, even if it's only for the span of an afternoon spent scanning the lively etiquette of whitecaps along the horizon through binoculars, in case they are serviettes caught on the breeze, or a hat thrown skyward in exuberance, a balloon let go from the heart of the crowd, deliberately and for you. That's the garden party. Really takes you on a journey, right? Like it starts very concrete with these plaques on the benches, and then all of a sudden you're just all over the place. And I like the moments in a poem that kind of dip from the very tangible into this kind of like really metaphoric, like less tangible place. And I love, I mean, obviously that line, that the names of the dead, and remember, we never love anything deep enough to hold it in this world. Like, that line is heartbreaking. Like, that would be enough for me. I would be like, all right, good poem, finished. But then it keeps going into just this kind of like incredible detail of this very like magical world, lacquered in their own bright alchemy, or relaxing under umbrellas at glass-topped tables, or strolling through the lime trees with fistfuls of petits fours and fruits, where the serpent of eternity, locked in its perfect circle, sleeps in the calm shade beneath someone's chair. Like, it's like a Salvador Dali painting. So she's not a horse poet, right? Like obviously there's more to this woman than horse poetry. Not saying there's anything wrong with horse poetry, but she took us kind of out of the farm and onto a boat and then into the afterlife. So like props to Jude Nutter. Just a reminder, Curator of Silence by Jude Nutter is the book that I'm reading from. And she hasn't written, from what I could tell, she has not written a book of poetry since 2009. So I'm not really sure what's going on. I went to her website, and she offers her services to aspiring poets. I guess you can contract with her to get support writing your poems and get feedback and critique, and then support in your efforts to publish. So if anybody is looking for that kind of service, I'm not sure how up to date her website is, but if you search Jude Nutter online, you can find it. And you could potentially reach out to her for support writing your own poems, which I think is like a very accessible, interesting thing to do as a poet. I mean, I read an interview with her, and she is, kind of making her own way, like freelancing and picking up jobs here and there. And so I thought, wow, you just put it out there. And she has won tons of awards, both for her books of poems and for individual poems. And so, not a bad mentor to find. If her services are still available and you are a young poet, I would encourage it. Okay. So this is the last poem I'm going to read. I feel like it's very emblematic of the experience of writing poetry. It's called Naming the World. And this is kind of the magic of writing. If you're somebody that is a writer, the experience of sitting down and creating something that didn't exist before is like a very intimidating and like humbling thing. And I am always impressed with creators that are just able to make a whole world just from their own imagination. I mean, that's a reason that I am such a fan of the Adventure Zone, and I think so many people are, is that one, it's really collaborative, but two, it's also like Griffin creating this whole universe, with like the flexibility to let other people play in it. Like there's something very like generous and magical about that. But anyway, I could talk about Griffin all day. The poem is Naming the World. I remember what it felt like naming the world, setting the feet of each word carefully on the faint blue lines of the page, how the arms of an O came together, like a door closing, like a heart shutting down, how lowercase g could release me with a flourish from the hook of its tail, like my father's arm sending me skyward on a swing, thin legs and scuffed shoes over my head, a sudden jigsaw of leaves and sky and pigeons launching out over the park on a firm applause of wings, then the fall back earthward into those same arms. I remember the miracle of building with my own hand the roof of a letter, dome of a bird's skull, patina of light on wet bone. Back then, I thought God had formed the names of the animals over and over in the dirt until they had risen up, and he'd let them go. I was shamed by the emptiness inside my own name, by the headstone of each downstroke, by how easily I could be debrided by that pale pink nipple of rubber on the end of a pencil. Put it into words, we were told, as if language were a bucket, a mouth, a light blue shirt, fist, inkwell, bag of tricks, the complete white fire that was the body of a swan down in the reeds by the river. Locket, pencil case, the green lamp of a leaf, or those rooms inside the rain we walked through all day without entering. Why, when there is so little life to go around, do we still run out of places to keep it? And what else should we do with the words we tear from the currents of a poem but let them go? Such tenderness and generosity even I can manage. See, there are sentiments about death that I have chased to the sill of an open window, and the locked slaughterhouse of the heart I have set adrift in a rowboat without any oars, in which it will float unnoticed out between the jaws of the harbor. I will carry that brittle, bright hunger on which we float out into the forest and release it back into the earth. And, just in case the animal that ignites within the body, I will not separate from the body. Just in case, I will send them forward together. That's kind of another poem that like takes you somewhere completely different than where you started. Again, it starts very tangible. She's talking about the experience of creating and writing and kind of learning language and thinking about these letters and the significance of them. And then it becomes just this incredible abstract, at the locked slaughterhouse of the heart, I have set adrift in a rowboat without any oars, in which it will float unnoticed out between the jaws of the harbor. And let me tell you, like, I don't totally get it. You know, I think people feel like they have to get it to have an appreciation of poetry. Like a lot of you are probably sitting there being like, I don't know what she's talking about anymore. And that's fair. It helps if you really love language and you love kind of precise images and phrases that feel very right, even if they're very abstract. I feel like such a freedom in art. And it's so hard for me in the sciences and in math to really get behind the precision of it, because with art, like, I don't feel that pressure to get it right, and I don't feel constrained to what the artist is trying to tell me. You know, I don't feel like I'm not really going to appreciate it right. You know, I just feel like, oh, you know what I love? Like, I love how she talks about how the O comes together like a door closing. And, you know, dome of a bird skull, patina of light on wet bone. Like the language, those words together and kind of the image it creates, like that's enough for me. I don't have to get exactly what she's trying to say. And And that may be frustrating for writers to think there's a lot of people out there not really getting what they're saying, but I am not deterred by that. So again, that was Curator of Silence by Jude Nutter. It was published by University of Notre Dame Press. For those of you that I think want or may suggest that I have my own podcast that is just about poetry, I'm going to get ahead of that question. So it is something that I've explored, but the tricky thing is getting permission from poets to read their work in a timely fashion. I don't know poets to be particularly litigious, but really what I'm doing is I am potentially, like profiting off of somebody else's art. And as soon as I start selling ads against that, as soon as I start promoting it, it seems a little unfair to me, to the artist. And so I would have to do potentially a lot of work to get permission. And that's not something I'm particularly ready to look into, given that I am still working full time as a grant writer at a community college. So that is kind of my hesitancy. That, and also, there's another potential of kind of seeking out interviews and talking to poets directly and doing it that way. I mean, that's again something that, of course, would be incredible, but also very time consuming. So still kind of figuring out whether or not that's something I want to do. But I like it as now as like a little surprise on episodes of Wonderful. It keeps me motivated to return to poetry. So I went to graduate school, University of Chicago, and I got a master's in humanities. And the great thing about that program is that, like, one, it's a year long, and two, you have a lot of freedom within the program to pursue what you're interested in. And so I was interested in poetry. I was interested in writing poetry. So I did a lot of reading and writing of poetry in that 1 year, and I kind of burnt myself out. And so now it's been really nice to return to that. And so I am grateful to be able to do that through the podcast and to do that here today. So I will go ahead and take questions for maybe the next 10 minutes or so. But thank you all for joining me. I really appreciate it. Somebody asked if I would consider taking submissions. That would potentially be very labor intensive, because I like to read several of the poets' poems. I like to do some research on who they are, and the more widely published they are, the easier it is to find information about them. If you're asking, could you share poets that you like with me, then I definitely welcome that, whether it's on Twitter or through the Wonderful email account. But if you're asking if you want to submit your own poems to me, I'm saying that probably wouldn't make sense or be appropriate. But thank you for wanting to share your enthusiasm for poetry with me. I appreciate that. Would I ever share some of my own poetry on the podcast or in a live poetry corner? I actually have shared a poem I wrote on one episode of Wonderful. I'm not sure what episode of Wonderful that was, but I was talking about the writing process, and I shared a poem that I had written a long time ago. I think it was on, you can probably figure out what it is on that website, thewonderful.fyi. I don't write a lot of poetry anymore, honestly. I like the aforementioned burnout that I suggested kind of has made it difficult to do that. So it's been a long time. If I start writing poetry again, I will consider it. But again, I'm just trying to kind of get back into it. Hey, Rachel, who is your favorite poet? I really like Anne Sexton. I've been kind of saving her a little bit. She, like a lot of poets, is kind of a problematic figure. So I've been hesitant to kind of lift her up as this, example of superior poetry, because she has kind of a dark story. That whole group of confessional poets, including like Sylvia Plath and Robert Lowell, Ted Hughes, They're all kind of dark individuals, but some of Anne Sexton's poems are what kind of really inspired me to think like I am a person interested in poetry. So I would recommend her. Does reading poetry help or hurt your burnout? It helps tremendously. Like, poetry is very intimidating if you are not close to it. But when you read it and you get excited about it, it really helps you feel like, oh, this is really just like a collection of observations and emotions, and this is something that anybody could do. And so it's definitely helping me feel closer to it. Do you have any advice for someone who wants to write better poetry, being afraid to publish? I'm guessing that's kind of a two-part question. If you want to write better poetry, read more poetry. I mean, anybody would say that about any, discipline within the arts. I tend to really focus on relatively recent poetry. This is actually like a conversation I had with somebody recently. They were more interested in like ancient poets. And I find myself more drawn to poets that are speaking more to my own experience. And then as far as publishing, so this is interesting. So I worked at the Missouri Review for several years, and then I worked at the Chicago Review, which is another literary magazine at University of Chicago. And the advice we always gave people was to read the magazine itself. A lot of people would just submit and then they would send work that wasn't necessarily appropriate. So, for example, the Missouri Review, at least while I was there, accepted a lot of more accessible poetry, like less academic, less rigorous, more speaking to kind of human experience poetry. Whereas the Chicago Review, very academic, very complex poetry. So knowing that going in was really helpful. Seeing what other kind of poets they publish. Also, if you have a particular poet that you feel like you are similar to or feel inspired by, see where they're publishing. It's kind of the same trick I use as a grant writer. If we're proposing a project that is similar to what another college is doing, I like to look and see, well, who's funding them and see if they might fund us. Same thing with poetry. See where your other poets are publishing. And you can figure that out if you look at their book. If they have had poems from the book published elsewhere, which they probably have, they will have to credit that magazine as kind of the first publisher of that work. So that's a good place to look. And then simultaneous submissions is a big thing with literary magazines. Some don't allow it. A lot, and those are like the really like Poetry Magazine, the New Yorker. I don't know if they accept simultaneous submissions, but those are the kind of places where they want to feel like, if we decide to publish this, we can publish it. Whereas other magazines, you're supposed to let them know if you get published prior to them accepting your poem. So if you submit to like Plowshares, and then also submit to, I don't know if Tri-Quarterly is still a thing, but let's say you get published in Plowshares, then you have to tell Tri-Quarterly, hey, stop considering that poem. I got published elsewhere. That's the whole gig of simultaneous submissions. But it does allow you to just do one big push. And I did that when I graduated college. I never got published, which is not uncommon, but I did get comments. So the big thing is you'll get like a form rejection letter. But if they write little comments on the bottom, that suggests like, oh, they actually liked it. They liked it enough to leave you a comment. And so I did get some comments, and that was kind of the best I ever did. And then I stopped. So I tried, when I graduated college, so maybe like 2004, 2005. And then I tried again after grad school in like 2007, 2008, and then I just stopped. But I'd be open to trying again. A lot of poets say they sit on their work for a very long time before they even try publishing it. So I might go back and see if there's anything there worth publishing. Of course, trans rights. I anticipated that comment, and I am happy to lend my support to it. Any thoughts on Seamus Heaney? I have read some of his stuff. I don't have a strong affinity for him, but I think that's just coming from my own ignorance. What was your favorite thing about college? Oh, gosh. I loved my English classes. I loved my literature classes. I love reading something and talking about it with other people in like an academic environment. So it's like everybody has to read it. You know, you're like trying to do your best work. So it's not like a book club where people might not read it or are just like not interested in actually doing it. Like in a literature class, you have a bunch of people who are excited about literature, talking about what they read and how it moved them and what it reminded them of and what they thought of it. And oh, I loved it so much. I also love Pablo Neruda. That's actually not a bad poet to bring to Poetry Corner. Don't be surprised if you see that. What was the aftermath of the gushy carpet? Totally fine. Totally fine. What I spilled actually is what I am drinking today. I got a little burnt out on LaCroix, but I like the cherry lime a lot. But it does come in a very tall can. So it did tip over very easily. Do you listen to other McElroy podcasts? Yes. Primarily Griffin's. I listen to my brother and me in Adventure Zone. I occasionally listen to Sawbones and Schmanners, not as like religiously as I listen to Griffin's podcasts. I'm just honestly like I'm just a big supporter of what he does because I think he's very funny, and I think he's very smart. And I get to spend time with him through podcasts, like throughout my day when we're not together. So it's very nice. Have you read Do You Like Billy Collins? I do. I have shared Billy Collins before. I think in the Poetry Corner. I'm not so sure if that's actually true or not. But yes, I'm a big fan. Most of the poems you've brought have had loose, non-structured rhyme, meter schemes. Is that your preference, or what you're more familiar with? I mean, I like a good sonnet. I took a class in graduate school all on Shakespeare sonnets. I think the thing about a sonnet is that it's often very dense. Like structured poems where they have a particular rhyme scheme they have to follow tend to be very dense. And when I do Poetry Corner, I like to bring things that I can talk about in 5 or 10 minutes. And my experience with sonnets is that you always need more time than that. Where did I go to college? University of Missouri, Columbia, Mizzou. I grew up in St. Louis, Missouri, and so going to school in Columbia, Missouri was just 2 hours west. And I thought I was going to go to journalism school. And so that seemed like a really great place to go. But then I didn't end up doing it. I ended up pursuing English instead. It was one of Griffin's reasons for marrying you, your voice for good podcasting. No, I had no intentions of ever doing a podcast when I met Griffin. And honestly, what really motivated me was Sydney and Teresa doing it. And then I thought, oh, what would I talk about? And at the time, we were watching a lot of Bachelor. And I thought, well, what do I have expertise in? I guess it's The Bachelor. And so we did that for a while. And then Bachelor became just, it was always kind of terrible, but even too terrible for me to bear. And so then we switched to Wonderful. And the format allows me to become just a little bit of an expert in things, since I don't have to speak the whole show about it. And I really enjoy doing it. How do I feel about slam poetry? Okay, so this is interesting. So when I moved to Chicago, I had just finished college. I've been working at the Missouri Review. And the slam poetry scene in Chicago at the times, 2004, 2005, and I think it's still true, was huge. And so I did two things pretty soon after I graduated college. I got an internship at the Poetry Center of Chicago, and then simultaneously I got a job coordinating volunteers for Louder Than a Bomb. So this was 2005, and then I ended up coordinating volunteers for Louder Than a Bomb in 2006 too, and then I went to school, and then it was harder to do it. And so I got to see a bunch of really incredible teenagers do slam poetry. It's the world's largest teen slam poetry festival. It's only gotten bigger since I stopped working with it And it is incredible. Performance poetry done well is so inspiring and so moving. And if you have an opportunity to see any of it, I would recommend it. I mean, there is a format to it. Like, we would make jokes of like the cadence of reading a slam poem and the type of subject matter. Like, you'll see a lot of similarities across different slam poets and different subject matter, but it can be so powerful. And they would also do like group pieces, which I think I've talked about on Wonderful before. So I very much recommend it. Any other questions? I've gone a little bit longer than I anticipated, but I am willing to stick around for another 5-10 minutes. Were you in speech or debate as a kid? No. So there was a speech and debate program at our high school, but it was not widely promoted. And the people I knew that did it were not people that I was close with. And so I didn't think about it. It just wasn't a very popular or rigorous program at our school. So I didn't pursue it. What are some of your favorite novelists? So this is what's interesting. So when I did creative writing as an undergrad, I did short fiction as my emphasis. University of Missouri lets you do short fiction, poetry, or I think creative nonfiction. And so I did short fiction. And then when I started at Missouri Review, I started reading poetry. And then I started reading all of their online submissions. So they had just started accepting online submissions when I moved to Chicago. And so they had me remotely be their online editor. And then I started reading short fiction too. So all that to say, I am very, very interested in fiction. So short fiction. I like, well, I guess not short fiction. Novelists. I like Elizabeth Gilbert. Signature of All Things, legitimately, is one of my favorite books ever. I like Katherine Dunn a lot. I haven't read her newer book, but she wrote Geek Love, and I thought it was incredible. One of my favorite books of all time is 100 Years of Solitude by Marquez. Margaret Atwood. Oh my gosh, Blind Assassin. Very, very good book. I've read, I think, not her recent stuff, but pretty much every book she wrote, going up until like Mad Adam, I think. I haven't read that one yet. Do I have a Goodreads account? I do. Do I have a linguistics background? No, I don't. I've always really been interested in language, but I do not have a linguistics background. I have never taken a linguistics course. Do I watch Monster Factory? Yes, I watch Monster Factory. Are you going to upload this when you're done streaming? I think it already does that automatically. I think this will be saved on the YouTube channel. That is behind me is the chair that I received. It's very good. This is actually Griffin's chair. The bad chair is folded up behind the good chair. Any tips for reading poetry aloud? I try to pace myself a lot. I try to go slowly. I'd recommend that. Any recommendations for poems to read at a wedding? Actually, speaking of writing poetry, I wrote a poem for our friend's wedding. They asked me to write a poem, and what a great way to like motivate me. So I wrote a poem for their wedding. But Pablo Neruda is a great poet. We were just talking about him earlier. And so he writes a lot about love, and he's a great one to look at. Do you prefer reading poetry to yourself or hearing it read aloud? Both. That was the great thing about Chicago, man. There were so many. I went to so many poetry readings when I was in Chicago, both because of my graduate program at University of Chicago, and then I went to, when I was interning at the Poetry Center, I went to a lot of readings. I went to so many, and it's incredible, and I would recommend it. Universities are really kind of the place where you see live poetry readings these days, so I recommend that. It's wonderful going to open live on Become the Monster tour. Oh, you guys. So we did it in Austin once. I would like to do it again. As I mentioned earlier, I still work full time. I am using time right now to do this. I don't have a lot of vacation time. So, no, I will not be going out on tour as of now. I'll let you know if that changes. I'm also just like, I'm not really a performer. I maybe that seems hard to believe, but I would say the McElroy family, including the wives, are a troupe of performers. They all have been performers and done theater and pursued degrees in it. And that is just not me. I do it because I like to share things I'm excited about, and I like to do it with Griffin. But it is not an ambition of mine. So for the time being, I am planning to continue working full time and doing this kind of in my free time. Do you think lyrics are poetry? Yes, of course. Bob Dylan just not long ago got a prize for his lyrics as poetry. I think if it's done well, definitely. Oh my gosh. And also like hip hop, and there's so many elements of poetry in lyrics. Yes, 100% yes. What poems are you most excited to share with Henry when he's a little older? Oh my gosh. So I grew up loving Shel Silverstein. And the Children's Garden of Verses, the Robert Louis Stevenson that I talked about on Wonderful. I'm excited about that too, just because my grandma shared it with my dad and my dad shared it with me. And I think that would be awesome. I think I have heard of Sappho, although I have not read much of it. Chicago would be a great place for a live Wonderful. I would very much like to do that if it works out okay. I have a lot of friends still living there. At my full-time job, I am a grant writer at a community college. Okay. I think I am going to call it. Thank you so much for joining me. Thank you very much for supporting Max Fun and for motivating me to do this. Thank you for loving poetry, which I'm assuming you all do. If not before I started doing this, now. So I really appreciate it. This has been really great for me. And have a good day, everybody.